October 14, 1942, Dayton, Ohio. The air inside the General Motors Inland Division plant carried the metallic tang of cold steel and machine oil. The fluorescent lights hummed above long rows of drafting tables, where blueprints lay scattered like the aftermath of a storm. Outside, the rain had turned the loading bays into rivers of mud. War was everywhere now, on the radio, in the factory, and in the weary faces of men who no longer built cars but instruments of survival. George Hyde sat alone at the end of the engineering bay, his spectacles sliding down the bridge of his nose as he read the memorandum stamped in red. Urgent, War Department Directive. It came from Colonel Rene Studler, the Army's procurement officer. The order was blunt. Design a submachine gun that performs like the Thompson, but costs 90% less. Hyde exhaled slowly, his pencil tapping against the page. He was 52 years old, a German-born immigrant who had spent 2 decades perfecting mechanical precision in American factories. He had seen elegant designs, machines of beauty that seemed almost alive. But now, beauty had no place. Every hour, every bolt, every dollar mattered. The numbers haunted him. The Thompson submachine gun, America's pride, the weapon of gangsters and Marines alike, cost nearly $200 per unit. At wartime inflation, that was more than 4 months of a private's pay. Equipping an army of millions at that cost was impossible. The Treasury had warned that at this rate, the United States could win battles but lose its economy. Hyde looked around the workshop and imagined the arithmetic turning into blood. Every overdesigned gun meant fewer rifles in soldiers' hands when they landed in Sicily, in Italy, in the jungles of the Pacific. Every polished surface meant one less weapon in the mud. He flipped open the manila folder that had arrived that morning. Inside, specifications that bordered on madness. The new weapon had to use the same .45 ACP ammunition as the Thompson. It had to be accurate within 6 feet at 50 yards. It had to fire no faster than 500 rounds per minute to save ammunition. And most of all, it had to be manufacturable using automotive methods. Stamping, welding, pressing. No hand-fitting. No carved wood. He ran his hand through thinning hair. "They want a gun made like a Buick," he muttered under his breath. It wasn't an exaggeration. The Inland Division had already built the one-shot Liberator pistol, a crude stamped metal weapon designed to be dropped behind enemy lines to resistance fighters. It could be made in minutes, not hours. Crude, yes, but effective. Perhaps that ugly little pistol held the answer to a much bigger problem. The challenge gnawed at Hyde's engineer's mind. He began sketching. 2 clamshell halves forming a receiver, welded together down the middle. A telescoping wire stock that could collapse into itself. He erased the traditional wooden grip entirely. The trigger assembly was reduced to the bare minimum. What emerged on the paper looked nothing like a gun. It looked like a tool, an industrial artifact, something you might find hanging from a mechanic's belt. But perhaps that was exactly what America needed. A weapon built by factory hands, not craftsmen. He worked for hours, alone with the hiss of rain and the hum of electricity. The war outside the walls demanded urgency, and yet the process required stillness. A balance between desperation and precision. By dawn, he had something tangible, a sketch labeled T-15. When his team gathered later that morning, the men leaned over the blueprints, skeptical. One mechanic whistled low. "You sure this ain't a muffler, George?" Hyde smiled faintly. "It's a gun that any of you can build. That's the point." Weeks turned into months. Metal presses clanged, welders sparked, and slowly, the first prototype came to life. It was rough, unfinished edges, hollow stock, sheet steel everywhere, but it worked. When Hyde test-fired the weapon behind the plant, the recoil felt soft, the rate of fire steady, and the mechanics smooth. It didn't jam. He felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. The initial cost calculations came back, $25 per unit. Not $200. Not $70. Just $25 of American steel and sweat. The dream seemed within reach. But Hyde knew numbers alone wouldn't win over the Army. Tradition was a powerful enemy. November 1942, Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. The chill bit through Hyde's overcoat as he stepped out of the car. Ahead, the long concrete range stretched beneath gray skies. Rows of officers waited, their breath fogging in the cold. They were men of rank and ritual, schooled in the aesthetics of walnut and blued steel. To them, the Thompson was not just a weapon. It was an icon of craftsmanship and pride. Hyde placed the T-15 on the bench. Its dull finish and stamped seam stood out like a wound against the gleaming rifles beside it. Major William Harrison, the chief evaluator, leaned in, eyebrows raised. "Where's the wood?" he asked flatly. "There is none," Hyde replied. "Stamped steel, sir. It can be made 10 times faster." The officer smirked. "Looks like it fell off a Buick line." Laughter rippled through the group. One called it garage junk. Another muttered that it looked like a plumber's mistake. Hyde stood silent. Engineers build for function, not applause. When the firing test began, the weapon performed flawlessly. 50 rounds. No jams. Tight grouping. But performance wasn't the issue. The problem was perception. After the test, the verdict came quickly. Rejected. The Army wanted cheap, but not that cheap. They wanted mass production without losing the illusion of artistry. They wanted something that looked like victory, not necessity. The drive back to Ohio was long and silent. Rain drummed against the windshield. The rejection stung, but more than that, it revealed a truth Hyde hadn't wanted to face. America's love affair with beauty could cost lives. When he reached Dayton, he went straight back to his desk. The rejection letter lay unopened. He didn't need to read it. He already knew what it said. He pulled out the blueprint of the T-15 and stared at it under the lamp's pale light. The officers had mocked its appearance. But what if they were right, for the wrong reasons? What if the very ugliness they hated was the source of its strength? Hyde took out a fresh sheet of paper. Across the top, he wrote a single question. What if ugly is better? December 1942, Dayton. He wasn't alone this time. Frederick Sampson, GM's chief engineer and a master of mass production, joined him. Sampson was the kind of man who could turn an idea into 1,000 machines before lunch. Together, they tore the weapon down to its bones. Every bolt, every weld, every ounce of unnecessary metal was reconsidered. The new prototype, codenamed T-20, emerged from the wreckage like a revelation. 2 pressed steel halves welded together. A sliding wire stock. A dust cover that doubled as a safety. It was crude, yes, but pure in purpose. Where the Thompson's receiver cost $15 to machine, the T-20's cost $2.50. The stock, 30 cents. The entire weapon could be built using car factory tooling. Hyde didn't bother polishing the exterior. Every dent, every weld line, was a badge of practicality. When they brought the new prototype to the range, the weapon spat .45 caliber rounds with unrelenting precision. Mud didn't stop it. Sand didn't stop it. When they dropped it into a puddle, it fired again without complaint. Sampson turned to Hyde, grinning through cigarette smoke. "Ugly's looking pretty good to me." Hyde nodded. "Ugly saves lives." He didn't know it yet, but that sentence would define the legacy of the next decade. By Christmas, the final testing data was complete. 99.7% reliability. Fewer moving parts. Faster to clean. Half the weight. 1/10 of the cost. The Army finally approved production. The designation was official: submachine gun, caliber .45 M3. $20.94 a unit. A gun that worked when beauty failed. And though the papers called it ugly, its design would soon teach America that function, not form, wins wars. January 1943, Anderson, Indiana. The guide lamp division of General Motors had built headlights for Chevrolets and Buicks. Now it would build guns. The factory floor that once shimmered with chrome now thundered with the sound of presses, welders, and the rhythmic cadence of war. Everywhere Hyde looked, there was motion. Forklifts hauling steel coils, stamping presses hammering out receiver halves, women in coveralls welding the clamshell frames together with sparks bright as magnesium flares. The transformation was breathtaking. Automotive engineers had become weapons manufacturers overnight. They didn't carve, they assembled. They didn't polish, they produced. And they did it faster than anyone thought possible. Each M3 submachine gun could be completed in less than 5 hours of labor. The same time it once took a machinist just to carve a Thompson receiver from a steel block. Now, an entire weapon rolled off the line every few minutes. Workers called them Hyde's lamps, half in jest, half in pride. They knew what they were doing mattered. The weapon they built was crude, simple, efficient, and it worked. In the control room, Frederick Sampson stood beside Hyde as a conveyor belt carried freshly assembled M3s toward the inspection line. 1,000 a day, Sampson said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "We used to measure progress in weeks. Now it's hours." Hyde nodded, his eyes fixed on the row of olive-gray weapons gliding past. "If we can build 1,000 a day," he said quietly. "Maybe we can save 1,000 lives." Every gun was tested, stamped, and shipped out under armed guard. From the heartland of America to the coasts, freight trains carried the new submachine guns to depots and armories. The grease gun, as soldiers would later nickname it, was ready to enter the war. But while the factory sang with progress, the barracks would soon hum with doubt. April 1943, Fort Benning, Georgia. Rows of recruits stood on the firing range, the spring sun baking the red clay under their boots. Crates stamped M3 were pried open under the watch of instructors who had grown up revering the Thompson. When the first men lifted the new weapons, their expressions soured. "It feels like a toy," one said. "Like a car part," another muttered. And soon, the nickname spread, the grease gun. The comparison was obvious. Its rounded receiver and stubby barrel looked like the lubrication tools found in any mechanic's shop. To the soldiers, it was an insult. To Hyde, it was a prophecy. Reports from training schools arrived within weeks. Weapon inspires little confidence. Aesthetics poor. Feels cheap in hand. The officers feared morale would suffer. Colonel James Harrison wrote in his training summary, "The M3 may function adequately, but soldiers do not trust what looks improvised. Confidence is as vital as reliability." Hyde read those words in silence. He had expected resistance, but not this deep. For the men who carried them, guns were not just tools. They were extensions of identity, symbols of strength. The Thompson had that aura. The M3 did not. And yet, Hyde believed that once the gun faced what it was built for, dirt, rain, and fear, opinions would change. He knew the battlefield would have no patience for beauty. July 1943, Sicily. The first American troops to carry the M3 into combat were tank crews. The men who fought from within metal boxes understood the value of smallness, of simplicity. The Thompson was too long, too heavy, too elegant for their cramped steel world. Inside the turret of an M4 Sherman, there was barely room to breathe. Every inch mattered. The M3's wire stock folded neatly against its body, sliding into the narrow compartment beside the radio. When German infantry swarmed close, when seconds meant survival, the crew didn't have time for ceremony. Staff Sergeant Robert Hayes described it later in his field report. "The grease gun fits where the Tommy won't go. When they came at us from the alleys, I could fire before my loader even lifted his." The M3's slow rate of fire, 450 rounds per minute, gave Hayes control the Thompson never could. It didn't climb, it didn't spray wildly. It aimed, it hit, it kept firing. For the first time, Hyde's ugly gun earned respect, not from tests, but from combat. Across the Atlantic, in the dense jungles of New Guinea, the verdict came from a different kind of battlefield. Marines carried Thompsons through the heat, through the mud, through swarms of insects that chewed through gear and men alike. The humidity soaked everything. Metal rusted overnight. Bolts jammed. Springs seized. Corporal Anthony Ricci wrote home from Bougainville. Day 2, Thompson jammed again. Picked up a grease gun from a wounded GI. Thing keeps firing no matter what I throw at it. Dropped it in a stream. Still works. Haven't cleaned it once. The M3's enclosed action, dismissed by officers as primitive, was its secret weapon. Sand, mud, and water couldn't get inside. Its simplicity made it immune to neglect. The Marines didn't care that it looked crude. They cared that it worked when nothing else did. December 1944, Belgium. Snow blanketed the Ardennes like a shroud. The cold was merciless, the kind that froze oil and stiffened steel. At the front, men huddled in foxholes, their weapons wrapped in blankets to keep the frost at bay. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. German artillery thundered through the forests, shaking the ground. Private Michael Sullivan of the 2nd Infantry Division would remember that winter for the rest of his life. "Johnson's Thompson froze solid," he wrote to his sister. "Couldn't even pull the bolt. My grease gun fired all night long. That ugly thing saved us." In the bitter cold, the M3's simplicity was salvation. No small springs to jam, no delicate tolerances to seize. The heavy bolt cycled like a heartbeat, steady and unbothered by the weather. German reports from captured officers noted it with grudging respect. American grease gun, simple, reliable, dangerous. Always works, even in ice. By the time the snow melted, the M3's reputation had changed. Soldiers no longer mocked its appearance. They began to request it. The same officers who once called it a garage tool now called it the soldier's friend. March 1945, Dayton, Ohio. Word of the M3's success reached the Inland Division through telegrams and clippings. But along with praise came new danger. Reports surfaced of faulty springs and cracked bolts from overworked factories rushing to meet impossible quotas. Critics who had long opposed Hyde's design seized the moment. Committees convened. Some called for a return to the Thompson. Hyde sat through meetings where bureaucrats recited lists of minor defects as if they were crimes. He let them finish, then placed an M3 on the table and disassembled it in silence. 8 parts. That was all. 8 pieces that fit together like logic. "Gentlemen," he said, "you can fix these problems in a day. But the war doesn't wait for a redesign." He and Frederick Sampson set to work correcting every fault. Stronger steel. Adjusted spring tension. Improved quality control. Within weeks, the new version rolled out, M3A1. No cocking handle. No fragile components. Just a finger hole in the bolt, simple and foolproof. When the first batch reached the front, soldiers noticed the difference immediately. The new model was tougher, lighter, more reliable. By the war's end, the M3 had achieved something even its creators hadn't imagined. More than 500,000 built, saving the Army over $150 million in production costs. For George Hyde, it was vindication. The ugly gun had survived every test, the mud, the cold, the skepticism, the bureaucracy. It had proven that in the crucible of war, beauty was a liability. June 1945, Okinawa. As American forces closed in on Japan, the grease gun's final test came in the humid hell of the Pacific's last great battle. Corpsmen carried them. Engineers carried them. Even officers who had sworn by the Thompson now slung the M3 over their shoulders. In the caves and tunnels of Okinawa, where visibility vanished and every step could mean death, the weapon's light frame and simple safety made it perfect. Pull open the dust cover, ready to fire. Close it safe. No confusion, no delay. A lieutenant wrote in his journal, "It's not pretty, but it's the only thing that never quits." When the guns finally fell silent, the war that had birthed the M3 was ending. But its service was only beginning. September 1945, Washington, D.C. In a small office within the War Department, Colonel Studler reviewed the final production report. He ran a hand down the page and smiled faintly. Unit cost, $20.94. Reliability, 99.7%. The report's closing line read, "Recommended for continued service." The Thompson had been retired, not by obsolescence, but by economics. The era of beautiful guns was over. And somewhere in Dayton, George Hyde stood in his quiet workshop, the war behind him, the machines silent again. On his drafting table lay a worn schematic, the same one he had drawn under the glow of a single lamp 3 years earlier. The paper was smudged, the edges torn, but the title still clear. M3, Function Before Form. January 1951, near Seoul, Korea. The wind rolled off the frozen Han River, cutting through American lines like a knife. Snow drifted across foxholes and steel helmets. Every weapon, every boot, every lungful of air fought against the same enemy, the cold. Private Robert Shine rubbed his hands together, breath fogging in the dim light of dawn. The attack was coming. Everyone could feel it. The night had been quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that always came before the Chinese broke through. He reached for his weapon, a gun he had hated since basic training. The M3. The grease gun. The cheap one. When he'd first been issued it at Fort Lewis, he'd cursed whoever thought it was fit for war. The Thompson looked like a hero's weapon. The M3 looked like a plumbing mistake. But now, as the temperature dropped to 20 below and frost turned the barrels of other weapons to brittle glass, he pulled back the bolt, and it moved. Smooth. Ready. When the attack began, his gun didn't jam. It didn't freeze. It didn't fail. "That ugly gun brought me home," he would later write. Across the Korean front, story after story repeated the same truth. When the weather, mud, or chaos crippled everything else, Hyde's weapon kept firing. Soldiers who had once mocked its shape now fought to carry one. The Korean War was more than another battlefield. It was the final trial for George Hyde's creation, a test against nature itself. Weapons that survived the Pacific's heat and Europe's mud now faced the Arctic's breath. And once again, the M3 endured. Reports from ordnance officers told the same story. While Thompson seized under frozen lubricants, M3s continued to operate with minimal cleaning. The weapon's simplicity, once scorned, became its greatest advantage. It needed almost nothing to survive. Chinese after-action reports captured by intelligence units even acknowledged it. American grease gun, most reliable in cold, simple, deadly, short range but effective. For the men who carried it, the M3 was more than a tool. It was proof that someone somewhere had understood what the battlefield really demanded, not elegance but endurance. 1953, Washington, D.C. In a War Department meeting, procurement officers reviewed post-war performance data. Columns of statistics filled the table: malfunction rates, production costs, maintenance hours. One line stood out: M3 submachine gun, caliber .45, reliability, 99.7%. A colonel leaned back in his chair. So, the ugliest gun we ever built turned out to be the best one. No one disagreed. The Thompson had faded into history, a legend of a different age. The M3 remained in service. Simple, reliable, cheap. It became the quiet standard by which all new designs were judged. George Hyde, now aging in gray, never sought the spotlight. He wasn't the kind of man who needed medals or speeches. His satisfaction came from knowing that when soldiers reached for a weapon in the dark, it worked. That was enough. 1957, Fort Knox, Kentucky. On a training range, young recruits were still being handed M3s. The war was over, but the lessons lingered. Instructors no longer mocked its looks. They taught from experience how a weapon's worth is measured not by admiration, but by survival. One sergeant told his class, the Thompson was art. The M3 is insurance. You don't frame it, you trust it. The soldiers laughed, but the truth stuck. The M3's low rate of fire made it controllable. Its enclosed action made it nearly immune to mud. Its simplicity made it easy to repair with a screwdriver and common sense. And its low cost meant the Army could field thousands without hesitation. It wasn't perfect. No weapon was. But it was the closest thing to a mortal the battlefield had ever seen. 1963, Dayton, Ohio. George Hyde's house sat quiet at the edge of the city where it had all begun. The war plants were long silent. The drafting tables covered in dust. Hyde's health had been failing for months. The world was already moving on. New wars, new weapons, new ideologies. But among engineers, his name carried quiet reverence. He never became rich. He never sought fame. But he had changed the course of American military design forever. When he passed away that spring, few newspapers took notice. There were no parades, no ceremonies. But in the armories of the U.S. Army, his legacy lived in steel. Thousands of M3s remained in active service. The gun he built for pennies was still protecting soldiers 20 years later. Vietnam, 1968. A helicopter crew chief crouched beside a UH-1 Huey, his M3A1 slung low across his chest. Rain hammered the landing zone, thick and endless. The weapon, already 25 years old, still fired every time he pulled the trigger. It was the same sound that echoed through Italy, Normandy, and Korea, a slow, deliberate rhythm that symbolized reliability. Not beautiful, not loud, just there when needed. The M3 had become a soldier's secret, a tool that didn't shine but never quit. As the decades passed, the M3's story spread quietly through the ranks. Young engineers studied its blueprints in military design schools, tracing each decision Hyde had made. They realized that the weapon was more than a clever machine. It was a philosophy, a reminder that effectiveness is the truest form of beauty. Where others saw ugliness, Hyde had seen truth. Where officers demanded tradition, he offered innovation. And when his ideas were mocked, he doubled down on what mattered: function. The result was not just a gun, it was a doctrine, a shift in how America built for war. By the 1970s, almost every modern American weapon carried the fingerprints of Hyde's thinking. Stamped components, simplified parts, modular designs that prioritize performance over appearance. From rifles to armored vehicles, the principle was the same. If it works under fire, it's right. The M3 had proven that principle beyond question. It had fought in the mud of Anzio, the jungles of Luzon, the frozen ridges of Korea, and the swamps of Vietnam. It had served longer than many of the men who first carried it, and it had outlasted the doubts that once surrounded it. Even when newer weapons like the M16 appeared, the M3 remained in armories and special units, its quiet reliability unmatched. Mechanics, tank crews, and helicopter pilots continued to carry it, trusting its simplicity in places where nothing else worked. In military museums today, visitors often walk past the M3 without a second glance. Its dull gray frame doesn't catch the light the way polished walnut once did. It looks plain, even primitive. But those who know history stop. They understand what it represents. They see the triumph of practicality over pride, the victory of an engineer's logic over bureaucracy's blindness. And somewhere between the smudged welds and the utilitarian shape lies a quiet kind of beauty, the beauty of something that never pretended to be more than it was. George Hyde's creation did more than change how America built weapons. It changed how America thought about innovation. It proved that revolution often arrives disguised as simplicity, that progress is sometimes mistaken for ugliness, that the most extraordinary ideas are born not from glory, but from necessity. His gun, once mocked as a garage tool, became the symbol of American ingenuity stripped to its essence. It was the machine that taught a generation of engineers that perfection isn't what looks flawless, it's what works flawlessly. For decades, soldiers would tell new recruits the same story. When the fancy guns froze, when the beautiful ones jammed, the ugly one kept firing. That line became folklore, whispered in motor pools and barracks, in jungles and frozen mountains. And though many never knew the name of the man who made it possible, every one of them carried a piece of his legacy in their hands. The M3 didn't win wars with appearance. It won with endurance. It didn't need to shine to matter. It just needed to work. And it always did. The historian who studies the M3 today finds more than a weapon. He finds a parable, a lesson about how progress really happens, through people willing to defy tradition and embrace what works. George Hyde's $20 gun was never meant to be beautiful. But in the mud, the cold, and the chaos, it became the most reliable companion a soldier could have. And in that reliability, in that refusal to fail, it became something more than a machine. It became a philosophy, that the most beautiful solution is the one that works when everything else doesn't.